The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Pinewood as General Victoria Hayes drove through the small town. She had spent the weekend visiting her sister who lived 2 hours away and was now heading back to Fort Henderson where she was stationed. Victoria wore simple civilian clothes, including a plain blue jacket and comfortable jeans. Her dark hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she looked like any other traveler passing through the sleepy town. The drive had been peaceful so far, and she enjoyed these rare moments when she could simply be herself without the weight of command on her shoulders. She approached a 4-way stop sign near the center of town and brought her modest gray sedan to a complete stop. Victoria looked both ways carefully before proceeding through the intersection. The streets were mostly empty except for a few parked cars and a couple walking their dog on the sidewalk. She continued driving at the posted speed limit of 25 miles per hour and was already thinking about the briefing she had scheduled for Monday morning. The weekend had been a welcome break, but duty always called her back. Behind her, a police cruiser suddenly appeared with its lights flashing blue and red. Victoria glanced in her rearview mirror and felt a small knot of surprise in her stomach. She had not been speeding and was certain she had stopped at the sign. Nevertheless, she calmly pulled over to the side of the road and put her car in park. She rolled down her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, where they would be clearly visible. Years of training and discipline made these actions automatic, even though she was not in uniform. 2 officers approached her vehicle, and the one on the driver's side was a man in his early 30s with sandy blonde hair and a swagger in his step. His nameplate read Monroe. The other officer was younger and darker-haired with the name Stevens on his uniform. Officer Danny Monroe leaned down to her window with an expression that was more aggressive than professional. He asked for her license and registration, without any greeting or explanation for the stop. Victoria reached slowly for her glove compartment and retrieved the documents. Along with her military identification card, she handed them to Officer Monroe with a polite greeting and asked respectfully what the reason for the stop was. Danny glanced at the documents and then looked at her military ID with obvious skepticism. He held it up and squinted at it as if examining a counterfeit bill. A smirk crossed his face and he turned to show it to his partner Kyle, who looked less certain about the situation. Danny told her she had run the stop sign back at the intersection. Victoria remained calm and respectful as she explained that she had come to a complete stop and had looked both ways before proceeding. Her voice was steady and professional without any hint of anger or defensiveness. She had dealt with far more stressful situations in her military career, and a traffic stop was not going to rattle her composure. Danny, however, seemed irritated by her calm response and his tone became more aggressive. He made a comment about weekend warriors and asked if she got the military ID from a costume shop. Kyle shifted uncomfortably and suggested they just run the information through the system. Danny ignored him and continued to study the ID card with exaggerated suspicion. He asked Victoria what rank she claimed to be, and when she replied calmly that she was a general, he laughed outright. The laugh was not friendly but mocking and dismissive. Victoria explained that she was stationed at Fort Henderson about 40 miles away and that she was returning from visiting family. She offered to provide additional contact information if they needed to verify her identity. Danny told her that anyone could print fake IDs these days, and that he had seen plenty of people pretending to be military for attention or benefits. His words were clearly intended to provoke a reaction, but Victoria maintained her composure. She had not gotten to her rank by losing her temper at insults. Kyle suggested again that they simply verify the information, but Danny was on a roll now. He asked Victoria why a real general would be driving such an ordinary car and wearing such plain clothes. He said generals drove fancy cars and had drivers. Victoria explained patiently that she preferred to drive herself when off duty, and that she did not believe in wasting taxpayer money on unnecessary luxuries. This seemed to annoy Danny even more, as if her reasonableness was an affront to him. The situation continued to deteriorate as Danny demanded she step out of the vehicle. Victoria asked if she was being detained or arrested and what the specific charges were. Danny said she was being difficult and uncooperative, which was rich considering she had been nothing but polite and compliant. Kyle looked increasingly uncomfortable and checked his watch as if hoping this would end soon. Danny, however, seemed to be enjoying the power dynamic. Victoria complied with the order and stepped out of her car slowly and carefully. She was a woman of average height and build, but she carried herself with unmistakable confidence and authority. Even in civilian clothes, there was something about her bearing that spoke of command. Danny either did not notice or chose to ignore it. He told her to place her hands on the hood of the car and began to lecture her about respecting law enforcement and not making up stories. She remained silent now and simply complied with his instructions. Her mind was already working through the situation and calculating the best course of action. She knew that escalating the confrontation would serve no purpose and that the truth would come out eventually. Kyle moved closer and spoke quietly to Danny, suggesting they just write a ticket and let her go. Danny shook his head and said that people who lied about being military deserved to learn a lesson. Victoria asked again to speak with a supervisor or to have her identity verified through proper channels. Danny responded by telling her she was now being detained for obstruction and disorderly conduct. Kyle protested weakly that she had not been disorderly at all, but Danny cut him off. He pulled out his handcuffs and told Victoria to turn around and place her hands behind her back. She did so without resistance and felt the cold metal close around her wrists. As Danny led her to the police cruiser, Victoria remained calm and centered. She had faced enemy fire and made life-or-death decisions affecting thousands of troops. Two small-town cops with inflated egos were not going to break her composure. She sat in the back of the cruiser and watched through the window as Kyle retrieved her personal belongings from her car. Danny was already on his radio calling in the arrest and sounding quite pleased with himself. Victoria closed her eyes briefly and took a deep breath. This was going to be a longer evening than she had planned, but she knew exactly what to do when they allowed her that one phone call. The Pinewood Police Station was a small single-story brick building that looked like it had been built sometime in the 1970s. The paint on the walls was faded and the fluorescent lights hummed with an irritating buzz. Danny pulled the cruiser into the parking lot behind the building, and Kyle followed in Victoria's sedan. Through the metal grate separating the back seat from the front, Victoria could see Danny talking animatedly on his phone and gesturing with his free hand. He was clearly excited about the arrest and probably already telling the story to whoever would listen. Kyle opened the rear door and helped Victoria out of the vehicle with considerably more courtesy than his partner had shown. He looked troubled and kept glancing at her military ID, which Danny had shoved into the folder with her other documents. Victoria thanked him quietly for his consideration, and Kyle nodded but said nothing. He seemed like someone who had learned early in his career not to contradict his more senior partner even when he knew something was wrong. They entered through the back door of the station, and the smell of old coffee and industrial cleaner hit Victoria immediately. The building had the worn, tired feeling of a place that had seen too many years of service without enough maintenance or care. A dispatcher sat behind a glass partition working on paperwork and barely looked up as they entered. Danny was already inside and talking to a heavy-set man in his late 50s who wore a sheriff's uniform with various pins and medals that seemed excessive for such a small department. "Sheriff?" Paul Garrett turned to look at Victoria as Danny led her into the main area. His face showed immediate skepticism and something else that Victoria recognized from years of dealing with difficult personalities. It was the look of a man who did not like being challenged or questioned, and who saw outsiders as threats to his authority. Danny handed him the folder with Victoria's documents and began explaining the situation with considerably more embellishment than accuracy. According to Danny's version of events, Victoria had been driving recklessly through town and had become belligerent and aggressive when pulled over. He claimed she had refused to cooperate and had tried to intimidate them with a fake military ID. Kyle stood off to the side and said nothing to contradict these lies, though his expression showed his discomfort. Sheriff Garrett flipped through the documents and paused at the military ID. He held it up to the light and then tossed it dismissively onto his desk. The sheriff told Danny he had done good work and that too many people these days thought they could get away with stolen valor and fake credentials. He looked at Victoria directly and asked her where she really got the ID from. Victoria responded calmly that it was genuine and that she was an active duty general stationed at Fort Henderson. She suggested they contact the base to verify her identity. Sheriff Garrett laughed and said he had heard every story in the book and hers was not even creative. Victoria remained standing with her hands still cuffed behind her back. She asked politely if they intended to charge her with something or if she was free to go. Danny jumped in and said she was being charged with running a stop sign, obstruction of justice, and disorderly conduct. Victoria pointed out calmly that she had not been disorderly and that she had cooperated fully with every instruction. Sheriff Garrett cut her off and said that arguing with him right now was proving their point about her being difficult. The situation was becoming increasingly absurd, but Victoria knew that losing her temper would only make things worse. She had dealt with hostile forces in combat zones and corrupt officials in foreign countries. She could certainly handle a small-town sheriff with an ego problem. She asked again if they would verify her identity through official channels. Sheriff Garrett told her they would get around to it eventually, but right now she was going to be processed and placed in holding like any other. Arrestee Kyle was instructed to remove her handcuffs so she could be fingerprinted and photographed. The process was humiliating by design, and Victoria understood that this was part of the punishment these men thought she deserved. She complied with each step without complaint and maintained her dignity throughout. The booking officer was a tired-looking woman named Officer Amy Collins, who processed the paperwork with mechanical efficiency. Amy glanced at Victoria's military ID when it crossed her desk, and her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. After the booking process was complete, Danny led Victoria down a narrow hallway to the holding cells. There were 3 cells in total, and all were empty. The paint on the bars was chipped, and the single bench in each cell looked deeply uncomfortable. Danny unlocked the middle cell and gestured for her to enter. Victoria stepped inside and turned to face him as he closed the door with a metallic clang that echoed in the small space. Danny told her she could make her phone call in a bit once they finished the paperwork. He seemed to be enjoying the situation far too much, and Victoria could see he thought he had won something. She simply nodded and sat down on the uncomfortable bench. Danny walked away laughing and talking to Kyle about getting dinner from the diner down the street. Their voices faded as they moved back toward the front of the station. Victoria sat in silence and assessed her situation. The cell was clean enough but Spartan. A small toilet sat in the corner, and the single overhead light was bright and harsh. She had been in worse places during her career, including enemy detention during a training exercise that had gone sideways in her younger years. This was inconvenient and insulting, but not dangerous. She closed her eyes and began a breathing exercise she had learned decades ago to maintain focus and calm under stress. 30 minutes passed before Amy appeared at the cell door with a clipboard. She told Victoria quietly that she could make her phone call now. Victoria stood and followed Amy back down the hallway to the booking area. Sheriff Garrett was on the phone in his office, and Danny and Kyle were indeed gone, presumably to get their dinner. Amy led Victoria to an old desk phone and told her she had 5 minutes. Victoria thanked her, and Amy stepped back to give her a small measure of privacy. Victoria picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered, identifying herself as Captain Linda Morrison. Victoria spoke calmly and clearly. She gave her name and rank and then stated simply that she was being detained at the Pinewood police station on false charges. She provided the address and told Linda to contact Colonel Simmons immediately. Linda's voice changed instantly from routine professionalism to barely controlled alarm. She confirmed the information and told Victoria that help was on the way. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Victoria hung up the phone and turned to Amy, who was watching her with a thoughtful expression. Amy asked quietly if that was real, if Victoria was really a general. Victoria simply nodded. Amy bit her lip and glanced toward the sheriff's office where Garrett was still on the phone. She told Victoria in a low voice that she was sorry about this and that something felt very wrong about the whole situation. Victoria thanked her for her kindness and allowed herself to be led back to the holding cell. As the cell door closed again, Victoria sat down and allowed herself a small smile. The phone call had been made, and now the wheels were in motion. She had no doubt that Linda had immediately contacted Colonel Simmons, and that right now Fort Henderson was erupting into organized chaos. She had been patient and respectful throughout this ordeal, but that did not mean there would not be consequences for those who had abused their authority. She settled into wait, knowing that it would not be long now before everything changed. An hour had passed since Victoria made her phone call, and the Pinewood police station had settled into the drowsy quiet of a Saturday evening. The dispatcher, whose name was Helen, sat behind her glass partition reading her novel and occasionally glancing up at the radio console. The building's air conditioning hummed steadily, and somewhere down the hall a clock ticked with measured persistence. In the holding cell, Victoria remained in her meditative state, her breathing slow and controlled, her mind clear and focused. She had learned long ago that stress and anxiety were choices that a person made in response to circumstances. She could choose instead to remain centered and calm. Her body was still, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her shoulders relaxed. To anyone watching, she might have appeared to be sleeping, but her mind was fully aware and alert. She was counting the minutes and calculating how long it would take for a convoy to travel from Fort Henderson to this small town. She estimated they would arrive within the next 30 minutes if they had left immediately after her call. Amy appeared at the cell again, carrying a small first aid kit. She asked Victoria if she needed anything for her wrists, since the handcuffs had been on for quite a while during the initial detention. Victoria looked at her wrists and saw some redness, but nothing serious. She thanked Amy but said she was fine. Amy set the kit down near the cell anyway and told her it was there if she needed it. Then she did something unexpected. She sat down on the floor just outside the cell bars and spoke in a low voice. Amy said she had been a police officer in Pinewood for 3 years and that she had seen things that troubled her. She said Sheriff Garrett ran the department like his own personal kingdom, and that officers like Danny were encouraged to be aggressive and dismissive toward anyone who questioned their authority. She said she had thought about quitting many times, but that she had student loans and a mortgage and needed the job. She looked at Victoria through the bars and said she was sorry for what was happening, and that she knew it was wrong. Victoria listened without interruption, and then spoke gently. She told Amy that being a good officer meant standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. She said that Amy's kindness tonight had been noted and appreciated. She also said that in her experience the truth always emerged, and that those who did the right thing were usually rewarded, even if it did not seem that way at first. Amy nodded and stood up. She told Victoria she hoped things worked out and then walked back toward the front of the station. In his office, Sheriff Garrett was growing increasingly irritated by the phone calls. After the state police had called, he had received another call from someone claiming to be from the governor's office. That one he had dismissed as a prank because why would the governor care about a traffic stop in a small town? Then his personal cell phone rang and it was the mayor of Pinewood asking what was going on. The mayor said he had received calls from several important people asking about a military officer being detained. Garrett assured him everything was under control and that he had made a legitimate arrest. The mayor did not sound convinced, but he told Garrett to handle it and keep him informed. After hanging up, Garrett sat at his desk and felt that uncomfortable feeling in his gut growing stronger. He pulled out the military ID again and looked at it more carefully. It certainly looked official with its holographic elements and government seals. He used his computer to search for General Victoria Hayes and found several official military websites that referenced her. His stomach tightened. He told himself that anyone could make a fake website and that he was still in the right. He called Danny on the radio and told him to come back to the station. Danny responded that he and Kyle were checking on a suspicious vehicle near the highway, but would return soon. Garrett told him to make it fast. He hung up the radio mic and stared at the military ID on his desk. He was a man who hated admitting he was wrong, and who had built his career on projecting absolute confidence. The thought that he might have made a mistake was deeply threatening to his sense of self. Outside the station, the night was clear and cool. A few cars passed by on the main street, and the lights in the surrounding businesses had mostly been turned off for the evening. The town of Pinewood rolled up its sidewalks early on weekends, and by 8 o'clock, most residents were home watching television or getting ready for bed. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone and where nothing exciting ever happened. That was about to change. At Fort Henderson, the convoy was ready to roll. Colonel Simmons stood in front of the assembled soldiers and gave a brief but clear set of instructions. She told them they were going to retrieve their general from unlawful detention. She emphasized that they would conduct themselves with absolute professionalism and discipline. There would be no aggression or hostility, but there would be an unmistakable show of force. They were representing the United States military, and they would do so with honor and precision. Major Carter, the JAG officer, stood nearby with a briefcase full of documents. He had been on the phone for the past hour coordinating with various legal authorities. He had documentation proving Victoria's identity and rank. He had letters from the Department of Defense and notifications that had been sent to multiple law enforcement agencies. He had also prepared a list of potential federal charges that could be filed against the Pinewood Police Department if they did not immediately release the general and cooperate with the investigation that was now inevitable. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hayes, from the military police unit, climbed into the lead Humvee. Behind him, 3 more Humvees lined up, followed by 2 transport trucks filled with soldiers in full combat uniforms. The vehicles were equipped with lights and communications equipment. This was not a stealth mission. This was a deliberate and visible demonstration of military power and unity. At Colonel Simmons's signal, the convoy pulled out of the base and headed toward the highway. The drive to Pinewood would take approximately 45 minutes. The convoy maintained strict formation and traveled at exactly the speed limit. As they drove through the darkness, the soldiers sat in focused silence. Many of them had served under General Hayes at various points in their careers. They knew her as a fair and demanding leader who never asked them to do anything she would not do herself. The idea that she was sitting in a small-town jail cell because of some ignorant cops made their blood boil, but they channeled that anger into cold, professional determination. Back at the station, Helen, the dispatcher, noticed something odd on her computer screen. The system had flagged the name Victoria Hayes in multiple law enforcement databases. There were notifications from the FBI, Department of Defense, and state police, all indicating that this person was a high-ranking military officer and that any detention should be immediately reported. Helen felt her stomach drop. She printed out the notifications and walked quickly to Sheriff Garrett's office. She knocked and entered without waiting for permission. She handed him the printouts and told him these had just come through the system. Garrett read them and his face went pale. He stood up abruptly and told Helen to get Danny back here right now. Helen practically ran back to her console and radioed Danny with urgency in her voice. Danny responded that he was 10 minutes out. Garrett walked to the holding cells and stood looking at Victoria, who sat calmly on her bench. He asked her if she had people coming. Victoria looked at him and said simply, "Yes." Garrett returned to his office and began pacing. He was a man who had always controlled his small domain with absolute authority, and now that control was slipping away. He considered releasing her immediately and pretending this had all been a misunderstanding, but his pride would not let him. He told himself that he had followed procedure and that even if she was who she claimed to be, he had still been within his rights to make the arrest. He clung to this belief because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Danny and Kyle arrived back at the station and Danny swaggered in asking what the emergency was. Garrett showed him the printouts and Danny's confident expression faltered. Kyle looked at the documents and his face went white. He said quietly that they should release her immediately and apologize. Danny argued that they had done nothing wrong and that they should stick to their story. Garrett stood between them, paralyzed by indecision and pride. Outside in the darkness, the convoy was now only minutes away from Pinewood. The rumble of their engines could be heard in the distance like approaching thunder. In her cell, Victoria heard it first. She smiled slightly and stood up from her bench. She walked to the bars and gripped them lightly. She had remained patient and respectful throughout this ordeal, but she was about to be reminded that she was not alone and that she had the full weight of the United States military behind her. At Fort Henderson, the late afternoon was winding down into early evening, and most of the administrative offices were preparing to close for the weekend. Captain Linda Morrison had been finishing up some routine paperwork when her phone rang. She almost did not answer it since her shift was technically over, but something made her pick it up on the second ring. When she heard General Hayes's calm voice on the other end, stating that she was being detained at a civilian police station, Linda felt her blood run cold. Linda grabbed a pen and wrote down every detail as Victoria spoke. The general's voice was steady and professional, but Linda knew her well enough to understand the situation was serious. After the call ended, Linda sat frozen for exactly 3 seconds as her mind processed what she had just heard. Then she moved with swift precision. She dialed Colonel Patricia Simmons directly on her personal cell phone. Colonel Simmons was the second in command at the base and had served under General Hayes for 6 years. She answered on the first ring. Linda spoke quickly and clearly, laying out the situation. There was a moment of absolute silence on the other end of the line. Then Colonel Simmons's voice came through, tight and controlled. She told Linda to stay by the phone and to begin documenting everything. She said she would handle the rest. The line went dead and Linda sat back in her chair knowing that she had just lit a fuse that would have far-reaching consequences. Colonel Simmons stood in her kitchen where she had been preparing dinner for her family. She set down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables and walked into her home office. Her husband looked up from the living room with a questioning expression, but she shook her head to indicate this was serious. She closed the office door and began making calls. The first was to the base commander, Major General Craig Bennett, who was at a community event in town. She reached him on his cell phone and delivered the news in crisp military fashion. General Bennett's response was immediate and decisive. He told Colonel Simmons to activate the legal team and prepare a response unit. He said he would make calls to the state level and ensure that the proper authorities were notified. He also said something that made Colonel Simmons smile grimly. He said that General Hayes had been patient and respectful in an impossible situation, but that the United States military took care of its own, and this insult would not stand. Within 15 minutes of Victoria's phone call, Fort Henderson transformed into a hub of coordinated activity. The JAG office was contacted, and Major Glenn Carter, who specialized in military and civilian legal matters, was pulled from his Saturday evening. He listened to the briefing and began pulling up laws and regulations on his laptop. He made calls to the State Attorney General's office and to federal law enforcement contacts. He also began drafting documents that would be needed. Colonel Simmons contacted the military police unit on base. The commander of the MP unit was Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hayes, who was no relation to Victoria but who respected her greatly. When he heard what had happened, his jaw tightened and he immediately ordered his unit to prepare for deployment. He personally selected 40 of his best soldiers and instructed them to gear up in full uniform. This was not a combat operation, but it was a show of force and it needed to be done properly. The motor pool was activated and vehicles were requisitioned. 4 Humvees and 2 transport trucks were fueled and checked. The convoy was forming with military precision and speed. Soldiers moved with purpose, gathering equipment and preparing for deployment. Word spread through the base quickly, and those who were off duty began showing up asking if they could help. The general was one of theirs, and the loyalty she had earned through years of fair and strong leadership was now paying dividends. Meanwhile, at the Pinewood Police Station, the atmosphere was relaxed and almost festive. Danny and Kyle had returned from the diner with burgers and fries. They sat in the break room eating and laughing about the day's events. Danny was telling an embellished version of the story to 2 other officers who had come on duty for the evening shift. He portrayed himself as a hero who had caught someone trying to impersonate a military officer. Kyle ate his food quietly and did not add much to the story. Sheriff Garrett was in his office with his feet up on his desk reviewing the booking paperwork. He was pleased with how the day had gone. In his view, they had shown that nobody was above the law in his town, not even someone with a fake military ID and a confident attitude. He had dealt with plenty of difficult people over the years, and this was just another one. He figured she would spend the night in holding and be arraigned on Monday morning. By then, she would be cooperative and willing to pay her fines. The phone on his desk rang and he picked it up, expecting it to be his wife asking when he would be home for dinner. Instead, it was a crisp, professional voice identifying herself as someone from the Fort Henderson legal office. The voice explained that they were calling to verify the detention of General Victoria Hayes and to arrange for her immediate release. Sheriff Garrett felt a flicker of annoyance. He told the caller that he had a legitimate arrest and that the military had no jurisdiction over local law enforcement matters. The voice on the other end remained calm and simply said they would be in touch. The line went dead. Garrett shrugged and went back to his paperwork. He figured it was just someone playing along with the woman's story. 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time it was the state police. A sergeant from their internal affairs division was calling to inquire about the detention of a high-ranking military officer. Garrett felt his annoyance grow into irritation. He repeated that he had made a legitimate arrest and that he did not appreciate being second-guessed. The sergeant told him that the matter was being reviewed and that he should expect further contact. Again, the line went dead. Garrett stood up from his desk and walked out to the main area where Danny and the others were still eating. He told Danny that some people from Fort Henderson were making noise about the arrest. Danny laughed and said let them make noise because they had followed procedure and done everything right. Garrett nodded, but he felt a small uncomfortable feeling in his gut that he chose to ignore. He told everyone to finish their dinner and get back to work. In the holding cell, Victoria sat in meditation. She had been trained in various mental disciplines during her career, and she used them now to maintain her center. She was not worried or angry. She was simply waiting. She knew that by now, Colonel Simmons would have set multiple things in motion. She knew that phone calls were being made and that pressure was being applied at various levels. She also knew that the people in this building had no idea what was coming their way. Amy brought her a bottle of water and a sandwich from the diner. She set them on the bench next to Victoria and said quietly that she wanted Victoria to know not everyone here agreed with how this was being handled. Victoria thanked her sincerely and told her she appreciated the kindness. Amy hesitated at the cell door and then asked if things were going to get bad. Victoria looked at her calmly and said that the truth always came out eventually, and that people who abused their authority always faced consequences. Amy nodded slowly and walked away, looking thoughtful. As the sun set outside, the small police station continued its evening routine. The dispatcher changed shifts and the new person settled in with a cup of coffee and a paperback novel. Danny and Kyle were assigned to patrol and headed out to drive around town. The other officers on duty settled into the quiet rhythm of a Saturday night in a small town. None of them noticed the multiple phone calls being made by various officials. None of them saw the convoy assembling 40 miles away. None of them understood that they had made a catastrophic mistake and that within the hour their entire world was about to change. The rumble of heavy vehicles grew louder, and residents of Pinewood began stepping out onto their porches and looking toward the main street. The sound was unmistakable and unfamiliar in this quiet town. Children pressed their faces against windows and parents exchanged confused glances. Then the convoy appeared rolling down Main Street with deliberate precision. 4 Humvees led the way, followed by 2 large transport trucks. The vehicles were military green and bore the official markings of Fort Henderson. Their headlights cut through the darkness like searchlights, and the sound of their engines echoed off the storefronts. People on the sidewalks stopped and stared. Some pulled out their phones and began recording video. Others simply stood with their mouths open, trying to understand what was happening. A military convoy rolling through Pinewood on a Saturday night was unprecedented. The vehicles moved in perfect formation, maintaining exact spacing and speed. It was a display of discipline and power that was both impressive and intimidating. The convoy proceeded directly to the police station and pulled into the small parking lot and the street in front of the building. The lead Humvee came to a stop directly in front of the station's main entrance. The other vehicles arranged themselves in a semicircle, creating an unmistakable presence. Doors opened and soldiers began emerging. They moved with practiced efficiency, forming ranks on the pavement. All were in full combat uniforms, with boots polished and uniforms crisp despite the long drive. They stood at attention, creating neat rows of military discipline and unity. The effect was overwhelming. Colonel Patricia Simmons stepped out of the lead vehicle. She was a tall woman in her mid-40s with iron-gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her dress uniform was immaculate, with rows of ribbons on her chest, indicating years of distinguished service. She adjusted her cap and surveyed the police station with an expression of controlled determination. Behind her, Major Glenn Carter emerged, carrying his briefcase. He wore his service uniform and had the calm, focused demeanor of a lawyer who knew he held all the winning cards. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hayes organized the soldiers into formation. He gave quiet commands, and the troops responded with silent precision. Within 2 minutes of arriving, 40 soldiers stood in perfect ranks facing the police station. The visual impact was staggering. This was not a subtle diplomatic mission. This was a statement of power and a demand for respect. The message was clear and impossible to ignore. Inside the station, Sheriff Garrett heard the vehicles arrive and felt his knees go weak. He walked to the front window and looked out at the assembled military force. His face drained of color as he took in the scene. Danny stood beside him and for once had nothing to say. His earlier swagger had completely evaporated and been replaced by visible fear. Kyle stood further back and looked like he might be physically ill. Helen, the dispatcher, had abandoned her post and was standing in the hallway staring at the front door. Amy had been in the break room and came running when she heard the commotion. She looked out the window and felt a mixture of awe and vindication. She had known something was very wrong with this arrest, and now the proof was assembled outside. She glanced back toward the holding cells, knowing that General Hayes was probably hearing all of this and understanding exactly what it meant. Amy felt a strange surge of emotion that was part fear and part hope that justice was about to be served. Colonel Simmons walked toward the front entrance of the station with Major Carter beside her. The soldiers remained in formation behind them, creating a powerful backdrop. Several officers from the convoy flanked them, including military police with sidearms visible on their belts. The group reached the door and Colonel Simmons pulled it open with steady authority. She walked into the small police station, and the contrast between the military precision she represented and the chaotic energy inside the building was stark. Sheriff Garrett forced himself to step forward. He was a man accustomed to being the biggest authority in the room, and now he faced someone who outranked him in every meaningful way. Colonel Simmons looked at him with cool assessment. She did not raise her voice or show any aggression. She simply stood with perfect military bearing and let her presence speak for itself. Major Carter moved to her side and opened his briefcase. Colonel Simmons introduced herself clearly, stating her name, rank, and position at Fort Henderson. She then stated the purpose of her visit. She had come to secure the immediate release of General Victoria Hayes, who was being unlawfully detained. Her voice was calm and professional, but carried absolute authority. There was no question in her tone. This was not a request. It was a statement of fact and an expectation of compliance. Sheriff Garrett tried to recover his composure. He said that he had made a legitimate arrest, and that he had the authority to detain anyone in his jurisdiction, regardless of their claimed status. His voice wavered slightly and the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Colonel Simmons did not interrupt. She waited until he finished speaking and then nodded to Major Carter. Major Carter stepped forward and began presenting documentation. He had printed copies of Victoria's official military records, including her service history and current assignment. He had letters from the base commander at Fort Henderson and from officials at the Department of Defense. He had notifications that had been sent to multiple law enforcement agencies identifying Victoria as a high-ranking officer. He laid each document on the reception desk with methodical precision. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Major Carter then explained in clear legal terms what had occurred. He stated that General Hayes had been detained without proper cause and that basic verification procedures had been ignored. He noted that she had been respectful and cooperative throughout but had been treated with contempt and hostility. He explained that this constituted not only a violation of her civil rights but also a serious federal matter, involving the unlawful detention of a military officer. His words were measured and professional, but the implications were devastating. Sheriff Garrett tried to argue that he had followed standard procedures and that he could not have known the military ID was genuine. Major Carter responded that there were established protocols for verifying such identification and that none of those protocols had been followed. He pointed out that multiple phone calls had been made to the station, offering to verify General Hayes's identity, and that all of those calls had been dismissed or ignored. The pattern of behavior suggested not innocent mistakes but willful negligence at best and abuse of authority at worst. Danny stepped forward, trying to defend himself. He said that people fake military credentials all the time, and that they had been doing their jobs. Colonel Simmons turned her gaze on him, and he actually took a step backward. She did not say anything for a long moment. She simply looked at him with the kind of stare that only a career military officer can deliver. It was a look that stripped away all pretense and excuses and laid bare the truth. Danny's face flushed red, and he fell silent. Kyle had not said anything since the military arrived. He stood off to the side, looking miserable and defeated. He had known this was wrong from the beginning, but had lacked the courage to stand up to his partner and his superior. Now he was facing the consequences of that cowardice, and the weight of it was visible in his slumped shoulders and downcast eyes. Colonel Simmons stated clearly that General Hayes would be released immediately and without conditions. She said that the charges would be dropped and that all records of the arrest would be expunged. She also informed them that the State Attorney General's office had been notified, and that an investigation into the department's practices was already underway. Federal authorities had also been contacted and were reviewing the matter for potential civil rights violations. Sheriff Garrett looked like a man watching his world collapse. He tried one more time to assert his authority, saying that he would release the general, but that he had been within his rights. Major Carter cut him off. He said that whether the sheriff believed he was right or not was irrelevant. The facts spoke for themselves and the consequences would be determined by people far above the sheriff's pay grade. He recommended that Sheriff Garrett secure legal representation because he was going to need it. Outside the building, the soldiers remained in perfect formation. Word had spread through the town and more residents had gathered at a respectful distance to watch. Phones were recording everything and the scene was already being shared on social media. The small-town police station that had been so confident in its authority an hour ago now looked tiny and insignificant compared to the organized power of the military force assembled outside. Amy walked past the group of officials and headed toward the holding cells. It was time to release General Hayes and let her walk out into the presence of the people who had come to bring her home. 6 months had passed since the incident, and life at Fort Henderson had returned to its normal rhythm. Victoria sat in her office reviewing reports and approving training schedules. The weight of command was familiar and comfortable. She had led thousands of soldiers through multiple deployments and had earned their respect through competence and integrity. The incident in Pinewood had briefly thrust her into an uncomfortable spotlight, but she had weathered it with the same steady composure she brought to every challenge. Colonel Simmons knocked and entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. She set one on Victoria's desk and settled into the chair across from her. They had worked together for years and had developed the kind of professional relationship where words were often unnecessary. Patricia sipped her coffee and watched her commanding officer with thoughtful eyes. She finally asked the question that had been on her mind for months. Did Victoria have any regrets about how things had unfolded? Victoria set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. She considered the question carefully, as she always did. She said that she regretted the situation had occurred at all. She regretted that it had taken such a dramatic show of force for basic respect and justice to be served. She wondered aloud how many other people had been mistreated by those same officers over the years. People who did not have the resources or the support system to fight back. People who had simply endured injustice because they had no other choice. That was what troubled her most. Patricia nodded, understanding the weight behind the words. She said that the reforms in Pinewood were real and substantial. Other departments were learning from what had happened. The state legislature was considering new oversight requirements. Good had come from the situation, even if the situation itself had been wrong. Victoria acknowledged this, but said that prevention was always better than cure. The fact that it took a general being arrested to spark reform meant the system had already failed too many people. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The morning sun streamed through the office windows, and outside they could hear the sounds of the base coming to life. Soldiers jogging in formation, vehicles moving between buildings, the organized chaos of military life. Victoria had spent her entire adult life in this world, and she understood its rhythms and purposes. But the incident in Pinewood had reminded her that the military was not separate from civilian society. It was part of it and had responsibilities to it. A few weeks later, Victoria received an invitation that surprised her. The Pinewood Town Council was holding a ceremony to honor the reforms that had been implemented in the police department. They wanted to invite her to speak. Victoria was initially reluctant. She had no desire to revisit the incident or to make the town relive its embarrassment. But Amy Collins called her personally and explained that the ceremony was not about rehashing the past. It was about acknowledging mistakes and committing to a better future. Victoria agreed to attend. The ceremony was held on a Saturday afternoon in the town's community center. The building was small and modest, but it was packed with residents. Victoria arrived in her dress uniform, accompanied by Colonel Simmons and Major Carter. The crowd applauded when she entered, and Victoria felt a complex mixture of emotions. She had not wanted this attention, but she understood the importance of the gesture. The town was making a public statement about accountability and change. The new police chief was a man named David Chen, who had been brought in from a larger city with a strong record of community policing. He spoke first and acknowledged the failures that had occurred under previous leadership. He outlined the reforms that had been implemented and the cultural changes that were underway. He introduced the members of the new Civilian Oversight Board and explained how complaints would now be handled. His words were sincere and reflected genuine commitment to improvement. Amy Collins spoke next, and she did so with emotion in her voice. She talked about what it meant to be a good police officer and about the responsibility that came with the badge. She said that wearing a uniform was not about power or control. It was about service and protection. She said that the incident with General Hayes had forced everyone in the department to examine their consciences and ask hard questions about who they were and what they stood for. She thanked Victoria for her restraint and her willingness to push for systemic change rather than simply personal vindication. When Victoria stood to speak, the room fell silent. She looked out at the faces in the crowd and saw genuine hope mixed with lingering shame. She began by saying that she was not here to lecture or to judge. She said that every community struggled with how to balance authority and accountability. The question was not whether mistakes would be made, because they always would. The question was what happened when mistakes were uncovered. Did people defend them and hide them, or did they acknowledge them and work to prevent them from happening again? She said that Pinewood had chosen the harder but better path. The town could have circled the wagons and protected its own. Instead, it had opened itself to scrutiny and accepted painful reforms. That took courage and integrity. She said that the reforms would only work if the community supported them and held its police department to the highest standards. She encouraged residents to get involved in the oversight process and to view police officers as partners in public safety rather than as occupiers or adversaries. Victoria then addressed the police officers who were present. She said that being a law enforcement officer was one of the hardest jobs in society. Officers faced danger and stress that most people could not imagine. They made split-second decisions that could mean life or death. They deserved respect and support. But that respect had to be earned every day through professionalism and integrity. She said that officers who abused their authority or who looked the other way when colleagues did so were betraying not just the public but every good officer who did the job. Right, she concluded by saying that power without accountability was tyranny, regardless of who wielded it. She said that the incident that brought her to this town had been unfortunate, but that the response to it had been admirable. She expressed hope that Pinewood would become an example for other communities. She said that if her difficult experience could help prevent others from suffering injustice, then something good would have come from it. The crowd gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. After the ceremony, Victoria spent time talking with residents. Many thanked her for speaking out. Some shared their own stories of negative encounters with the old police department. Others expressed hope that things really would be different going forward. Victoria listened to each person with genuine attention and offered encouragement where she could. She met with several young people who were considering careers in law enforcement, and she told them that their communities needed good officers with strong values. Before leaving town, Victoria visited the police station. The building was the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. Officers greeted her respectfully, and Chief Chen gave her a tour of the new training facilities and the room where complaint hearings would be held. He showed her the body camera system and explained the protocols for its use. He introduced her to officers who had remained with the department through the reforms, and she could see in their faces a mixture of relief and determination. They were committed to being better. On the drive back to Fort Henderson, Victoria reflected on the journey from that initial traffic stop to this moment. She thought about Danny Monroe and wondered if he had learned anything, or if he simply blamed others for his downfall. She thought about Sheriff Garrett sitting in prison and hoped he was using the time to genuinely reflect rather than simply feeling sorry for himself. She thought about Kyle Stevens and hoped he had found peace in his new life, away from law enforcement. Most of all, she thought about Amy Collins and the other officers who were working hard to rebuild trust between the police and the community. They were the real heroes of this story. They had chosen to stay and to fight for change from within. That took courage and commitment. Victoria made a mental note to check in with Amy regularly and to offer whatever support and guidance she could. Good people trying to do good work deserved all the help they could get. Back at her office on Monday morning, Victoria found an envelope on her desk. Inside was a handwritten letter from a woman named Margaret Johnson who lived in Pinewood. Margaret wrote that her son had been arrested by Officer Monroe 3 years earlier on charges that were later dropped. The experience had left her son bitter and distrustful of all authority, but seeing how the system had responded to what happened to Victoria had restored some of his faith. He was now considering becoming a lawyer to help people who faced unjust treatment. Margaret thanked Victoria for standing up and for pushing for real change. Victoria read the letter twice and then filed it carefully in a folder she kept for things that mattered. This was why she served, not for glory or recognition, but because she believed deeply that institutions should work for people rather than against them. She believed that authority should be exercised with restraint and wisdom. She believed that justice was not automatic but required constant vigilance and effort. The weeks following the incident moved with the steady inevitability of a machine designed for accountability. Video footage from the traffic stop was obtained and reviewed by multiple investigators. The recording showed exactly what Victoria had described. She had come to a complete stop at the intersection. Officer Monroe's initial approach had been unnecessarily aggressive. Victoria's responses throughout had been calm and respectful. The video contradicted nearly every claim that Monroe had made in his report. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. The State Attorney General's office assigned a senior prosecutor named Catherine Price to lead the investigation into the Pinewood Police Department. Catherine was a woman in her early 50s, with a reputation for thoroughness and fairness. She arrived in Pinewood with a small team of investigators and began pulling records. They reviewed 5 years of arrest reports, complaint files, and disciplinary actions. What they found was a pattern of behavior that troubled everyone involved in the department under Sheriff Garrett's leadership had generated an unusually high number of complaints compared to similar-sized departments. Many of those complaints involved allegations of excessive force, false arrest, and racial profiling. Most complaints had been dismissed internally without serious investigation. Officer Monroe in particular had been the subject of numerous complaints, yet had never faced significant discipline. The pattern suggested a culture where aggressive policing was encouraged and accountability was minimal. Catherine interviewed dozens of Pinewood residents. Many were reluctant to speak at first. Small towns had long memories and people were afraid of retaliation, but as word spread that the investigation was serious and backed by state authority, more people came forward. Stories emerged of traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily, of arrests made on questionable grounds, of disrespect and intimidation being used as tools of control, rather than legitimate law enforcement techniques. One story particularly stood out. An elderly black man named Robert Collins described being stopped while walking home from church. Officer Monroe had questioned where he was going and demanded identification even though walking on a public street required no such thing. When Mr. Collins had politely refused and asked why he was being detained, Monroe had arrested him for obstruction. The charges were eventually dropped, but Mr. Collins had spent a night in jail and had been humiliated in front of his neighbors. The incident had occurred 2 years earlier, and no one had investigated his complaint. The investigation also revealed financial irregularities. The department had received federal grants for training and equipment, but records of how that money was spent were incomplete. There were questions about overtime payments and whether officers had been compensated for hours they had not actually worked. Sheriff Garrett's personal finances also raised questions. He owned property and vehicles that seemed beyond what his salary could support. The financial investigation was handed over to a separate team that specialized in fraud and embezzlement. The evidence mounted. The decision was made at the state level that Sheriff Garrett could no longer remain in his position. The governor's office, working with local officials, arranged for his immediate suspension, pending the completion of the investigation. A state police captain named Lisa Grant was brought in as temporary administrator of the department. Her first actions were to implement new training requirements and to establish a civilian oversight board that would review complaints. Officer Danny Monroe was terminated within 3 weeks of the incident. The combination of the false statements in his report, the video evidence contradicting his claims, and the pattern of complaints against him made his position untenable. He attempted to fight the termination through the police union, but even his union representatives seemed half-hearted in their defense. The evidence was simply too strong. Monroe hired a lawyer and threatened to sue, but no suit was ever filed. Last anyone heard, he had left the state. Officer Kyle Stevens was given a choice. He could resign quietly or face termination proceedings. He chose to resign. In a private meeting with the investigative team, he admitted that he had known the arrest was wrong, but had been afraid to speak up. He said that the culture of the department discouraged questioning senior officers, and that he had seen other officers punished for not showing enough loyalty. His testimony was valuable to the investigation, and he was granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation. He left law enforcement entirely and took a job at his brother-in-law's construction company. Sheriff Garrett faced the most serious consequences. Criminal charges were filed against him, including civil rights violations, official misconduct, and falsification of records. The financial investigation also resulted in charges of embezzlement and fraud. He hired an expensive legal team and prepared to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. 6 months after the incident, he accepted a plea agreement that included prison time and the forfeiture of his pension. His lawyer told reporters that Garrett maintained he had been doing his job, but accepted responsibility for mistakes in judgment. The civil lawsuit that Major Carter had mentioned also moved forward. Victoria initially was reluctant to pursue it, but Colonel Simmons and others convinced her that it was necessary to send a message. The lawsuit was filed not just against the individuals involved, but against the town of Pinewood itself for maintaining a police department with such poor oversight. The case was eventually settled out of court. The terms were not made public, but sources indicated the settlement was substantial. Victoria donated her entire portion to legal aid organizations that helped people who could not afford lawyers when facing unjust arrests. The Pinewood Police Department underwent complete restructuring. New leadership was brought in from outside the area. Every officer was required to undergo retraining, including courses on civil rights, de-escalation techniques, and cultural sensitivity. Body cameras were purchased and made mandatory for all officers. A new complaint process was established that involved independent review rather than internal investigation. The changes were painful and some officers resisted, but the alternative was the complete dissolution of the department and replacement with county sheriff coverage. Officer Amy Collins emerged from the ER situation with her reputation enhanced. She had been the only officer at the station who had treated Victoria with respect and who had expressed doubts about the arrest. When the temporary administrator Lisa Grant arrived, she recognized Amy's potential. Amy was promoted to sergeant and given a key role in the department's reform efforts. She became the liaison to the Civilian Oversight Board and helped develop new training materials. She also reached out to Victoria, and they met several times to discuss what good policing should look like. The incident became national news for a brief period. Videos of the military convoy arriving at the small-town police station went viral on social media. News outlets ran stories with headlines about military power versus small-town cops. Some commentators criticized the military response as excessive. Others argued it was exactly what was needed to check abuse of authority. The debate raged for a few weeks and then faded as new stories captured public attention. Within military circles, the incident was analyzed and discussed extensively. It was used in leadership courses as an example of how to handle difficult situations with restraint and professionalism. Victoria's calm response throughout the detention was held up as a model of discipline under pressure. The swift and organized military response was studied as an example of how institutions should protect their people. Several officers who had been part of the convoy later reported that it was one of the proudest moments of their careers. 2 months after the incident, Victoria was invited to speak at a conference on police-military relations. She accepted the invitation and used the opportunity to talk about respect, accountability, and the responsibilities that came with authority. She emphasized that the incident was not about military versus civilian authority. It was about right versus wrong, and about systems of accountability functioning as they should. She praised the many good law enforcement officers who did difficult jobs with integrity and said they deserved to work in departments that supported rather than undermined their efforts. The reforms in Pinewood became a model that other small departments studied. State officials used the case to push for broader reforms, including mandatory body cameras and independent complaint review processes across all departments. The changes happened slowly and with resistance, but they happened. Years later, when people talked about the Pinewood incident, they referred to it as a turning point in how small-town police departments were overseen and held accountable. Sheriff Garrett served 3 years in prison. Upon release, he gave one interview to a local newspaper. He said that he had believed he was doing the right thing, and that pride had prevented him from admitting mistakes. He said he had learned that authority without accountability was tyranny, and that he hoped his downfall would teach others to be more humble and more just. He said he thought about General Hayes often, and wished he could apologize in person, though he understood she had no reason to accept such an apology. Amy's hands shook slightly as she unlocked the cell door. Victoria stood waiting with calm patience, and when the door swung open, she stepped out with quiet dignity. She thanked Amy sincerely for the small kindnesses she had shown throughout the evening. Amy's eyes were wet with emotion, and she told Victoria she was sorry for everything that had happened. Victoria placed a hand on the young officer's shoulder and told her that she had nothing to apologize for and that her character had shown through when it mattered most. They walked together down the narrow hallway toward the front of the station. Victoria could hear the voices of Colonel Simmons and Major Carter speaking with Sheriff Garrett. As she emerged into the main area, everyone turned to look at her. Colonel Simmons' expression softened with visible relief, though her military bearing remained perfect. She stepped forward and came to attention, delivering a crisp salute. Victoria returned the salute, and then the two women shared a brief but meaningful look that spoke of years of mutual respect and trust. Major Carter approached and asked Victoria if she had been harmed or mistreated. Victoria considered the question carefully. She said that she had been detained unlawfully and treated with disrespect, but that she had not been physically harmed. She noted that Officer Collins had shown professionalism and kindness. Major Carter nodded and made notes on a legal pad. Every detail would matter in the investigation that was already underway. Sheriff Garrett stood behind his desk, looking diminished and uncertain. He started to speak, attempting to explain or justify his actions, but Victoria raised a hand to stop him. She walked closer to his desk and looked at him directly. Her voice when she spoke was calm and measured, but carried the weight of absolute authority. She told him that she understood he had a job to do, and that verifying identities could sometimes be challenging. However, she said he had failed at every point where he could have chosen to do the right thing. She explained that when she had first been stopped, she had been respectful and cooperative. She had provided her identification and offered to help verify it. Instead of taking those reasonable steps, Officer Monroe had chosen mockery and aggression. When she had been brought to the station, Sheriff Garrett had chosen to dismiss her identification without any attempt at verification. When phone calls had come in offering to confirm her identity, those calls had been ignored or dismissed. Every decision had been made from a place of ego and assumption, rather than from a commitment to actual justice. Victoria said that her rank and position were irrelevant to the core issue. If they could do this to her, they could do it to anyone. How many other people had been arrested and detained in this station based on the same kind of dismissive arrogance? How many people who did not have the resources or connections to fight back had been victimized by officers who believed their authority was absolute and unquestionable? That was the real problem, and that was why this situation could not simply be swept under the rug with apologies. Sheriff Garrett tried to interrupt, but Victoria was not finished. She said that being a law enforcement officer was a position of public trust. People depended on officers to be fair, reasonable, and committed to actual justice rather than personal ego. When officers abused that trust, they damaged not only their victims but the entire system that was supposed to protect everyone. She said that consequences were necessary not as punishment, but as a reminder that no one was above accountability. Danny, who had been standing silent, finally spoke up. His voice was defensive and angry. He said that they had been doing their jobs and that they could not be expected to believe every person who claimed to be someone important. Victoria turned to face him. She asked him a simple question. She asked if he had made any actual attempt to verify her identification beyond looking at it with suspicion. Danny stammered but could not provide a good answer. Victoria nodded and said that was the point. Verification was easy and would have taken minutes. Instead, he had chosen to escalate the situation based on his own assumptions. Kyle, who had been silent throughout, stepped forward. His voice was quiet and filled with shame. He said that he had known something was wrong but had not spoken up. He apologized directly to Victoria and said there was no excuse for his cowardice. Victoria looked at him with something close to sympathy. She told him that recognizing a mistake was the first step toward growth. She said that speaking truth to power was difficult, especially when it involved confronting colleagues and superiors. But that difficulty was exactly why it was so important. Colonel Simmons interjected at this point. She said that General Hayes had shown remarkable restraint and patience throughout this ordeal. However, the military could not and would not allow one of its senior officers to be treated this way without consequences. She stated that formal complaints had been filed with multiple agencies. The State Attorney General's office would be conducting a review of the Pinewood Police Department's arrest and detention practices. The Department of Defense had been notified, and federal civil rights investigators would be looking into potential violations. Major Carter added that in addition to the official investigations, there would be civil liability to consider. He said that General Hayes would have grounds for a substantial lawsuit against the department and the individuals involved. He noted that the entire incident had been poorly documented and that the dash camera footage from the traffic stop would be crucial evidence. He said that if that footage had been tampered with or deleted, it would constitute additional federal crimes, including obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence. Sheriff Garrett's face went from pale to gray. He sank into his chair and seemed to age 10 years in a moment. The full weight of what he had done and what was coming was finally hitting him. His small domain that he had ruled with such confidence was crumbling. His career was likely over and his reputation would be destroyed. Worse, his actions had brought shame on his department and his town. The consequences would ripple outward, affecting officers who had nothing to do with this incident. Victoria said that she took no pleasure in what was happening, but that it was necessary. She said that sunlight was the best disinfectant, and that problems could not be fixed if they remained hidden. She hoped that whatever came from this situation would lead to positive changes, not just in Pinewood, but in other small departments that might have similar issues. She said that law enforcement was a noble profession when done correctly, and that good officers deserved to work in departments that upheld the highest standards. Colonel Simmons indicated that it was time to leave. She asked Victoria if she needed medical attention, or if there was anything else that needed to be addressed. Victoria said she was fine and ready to return to base. She turned one last time to look at Amy, who stood near the hallway. She told Amy that she hoped they would speak again, and that she believed Amy had the potential to be an excellent officer if she was willing to stand up for her principles. Amy nodded with tears on her cheeks. The group moved toward the door. Major Carter gathered his documents back into his briefcase. Several military police officers who had been standing at attention near the entrance fell into formation. As Victoria stepped outside into the cool night air, she was greeted by the sight of 40 soldiers standing at perfect attention. The moment she appeared, they all saluted as one. The precision and unity of the gesture was powerful and moving. Victoria returned the salute and then walked slowly down the line of soldiers. She made eye contact with many of them and saw their loyalty and respect reflected back at her. These were her people. They had dropped everything on a Saturday evening and driven nearly an hour to stand with her. Not because she had ordered them to, but because they believed in the same principles she did: justice, respect, dignity, and accountability. Those were not just military values. They were human values, and they were worth defending. Colonel Simmons opened the door of the lead Humvee and Victoria climbed inside. The other officers and soldiers returned to their vehicles with the same precision they had shown in arriving. Engines started and the convoy began to pull away from the police station. Residents who had gathered to watch stood in respectful silence. Some saluted even though they were civilians. Others simply watched with expressions of awe and satisfaction. As the convoy rolled back through Pinewood and onto the highway heading toward Fort Henderson, Victoria sat in silence. She was tired and emotionally drained, but also deeply moved by what had happened. The system had worked. When injustice occurred, people of principle had responded. Authority had been checked by greater authority. Most importantly, the truth had emerged and would continue to emerge in the weeks and months ahead. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel gratitude for the people who had stood with her, and hoped that some good would come from this difficult night.